Hi, welcome back to my channel. For those who don't know me, my name is Katharine, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books I read in January. I honestly can't believe the end of January has already come upon us, and we have officially gotten through 1 month in 2025. I honestly feel like the year 2024 just started, so it's kind of unbelievable to me that January of 2025 has just ended. But anyway, let's get into all of the books that I read. I just want to preface that on my January TBR video, I put 5 books on there. It was a part of like my Vlogmas series. I'll tag the video down below of my January TBR, a part of that Vlogmas series like I was mentioning about, where I posted 1 video per day, 25 days leading up to and on Christmas. And like I mentioned, one of those videos was my January TBR, or to be read list. And I had only put 5 books on there because of the fact that I read about 1 to 1.5 books per week on average, and 5 is just like a reasonable number for me to put on my TBR list, so that way I'm not like too overwhelmed. I also like to refer to my TBR or to be read list as my pile of possibilities, because it puts less pressure on myself. And just in case, like if I don't get to a certain book that I said that I was going to get to, you know, it was just a pile of possibilities. It was just possible, you know, for me to get to that book and what I was in the mood for. I am a mood reader, so sometimes if I put a book on a TBR or a to be read list, and when it comes to that moment, sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm really not feeling it like reading this book right now, so I'm gonna put it off for, you know, a couple more weeks or a couple more months. But anyway, I did end up actually reading all of the books that were on my January TBR plus some. I actually ended up reading, I think, 7 books in the month of January. Let me double check and count. Yeah, I read 7. I have 6 physically over here, but I also have another book that I did read physically, but I ended up donating it. It was a pretty good reading month for me. Personally, I didn't have any books that were under 3 stars, which is a plus for me because I have had a struggle the past like couple months or even year of like having really bad books that I don't like. So this has been such a refresher for me in terms of reading, because I actually liked all of the books that I read this month. So let's just get into the books that I read, starting with the first book that I read this month, and then I'm going to go through the books in the order in which I read them. So let's just get into it. So the first book that I ended up finishing was The Housemaid by Frieda McFadden. For those who have watched my Florida trip or travel vlog, I'll tag that video down below. I actually got this book in Florida, and it was honestly so amazing. I was hooked from the first moment that I read it. For those who don't know, this is a thriller novel. I don't believe it's young adult. It's just like a regular adult thriller novel. And I was hooked. I was kind of hesitant about reading this because of the fact that I didn't know about, you know, the spice level in this, or like language and things, or like if it had any demonic undertones to it. But I honestly didn't feel too uncomfortable reading this. I mean, of course, it's a thriller. There's going to be like creepy aspects to it, but I really enjoyed it. Essentially, it's about this woman who is hired as a housemaid, and essentially she sees really creepy things going on in the house, and it just goes from there. I don't want to give too much away, but just know that it is a thriller novel about this woman who gets hired as a housemaid, and things start to go strange from there. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. I will never really give any thriller novels or thriller books more than 4 stars. I tend not to give them 5 stars or above. Sometimes I give books 6 stars. If you know me, I do give 6-star reads for the books that go like above and beyond even a 5 star. But anyway, I won't really give thriller novels more than like a 4 star, just because of the fact that like it is a thriller novel, and with thriller novels you know that it's going to be creepy and uncomfortable in some situations, and with those types of scenarios I just don't feel comfortable giving, you know, those types of books 5 stars, because usually with 5 stars or even 6-star reads, it's usually a feeling. And even though this did hook me in and like I could not put this down, I think I read this in like 2 or 3 days, which for me that's really fast. It wasn't at the level of like a 5 or a 6-star read, just because of the fact that it did have that creepy, eerie feeling that thriller books often have. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I definitely do recommend it if you ever are interested in reading any of Frieda McFadden books or the Housemaid series in general. I definitely recommend that you go pick them up. I'm actually planning on reading The Housemaid's Secret next, which is the 2nd book in the series. And you might have already seen that in my February TBR video, and I'll tag that video down below as well. But let's get into the next book that I read this month. So the next book that I read was not in this stack of books. I did read it physically. Actually, no, I didn't read it physically. I did have a physical copy of it, don't get me wrong, but I didn't actually pick it up and read it. I actually listened to it on audio, and it was a nonfiction book. It was More Than a Carpenter. I believe that's what it's called. It's by John MacDowell, and it's basically like an apologetics book, and it essentially describes like John MacDowell's experience from being like an atheist slash agnostic. And when he was in college, he came to know Christ and now has a really strong relationship with Jesus. And he is now obviously saved. And he wrote this book called More Than Just a Carpenter. And it basically describes the reasoning behind like his own conversion to being a Christian and becoming saved. And then it also kind of like answers a lot of questions that a lot of atheists or agnostics might have about the Christian faith. And I found it really interesting, even though like I grew up Catholic and I always knew about Jesus, I was never saved until I was probably like into college. So I definitely enjoy learning about how to like defend my faith, because I feel like a lot of the questions that were in this book also are questions that I get asked as a Christian from people who don't believe in the Christian faith. So it definitely helps me answer those questions, and like if I ever get stumped on like a really hard question that I don't know how to answer, at least now that I have the proper knowledge of how to answer those questions, those tough questions. But I gave it a 3-star just because it was kind of average. It was a short book. The audio book version of the book was only like an hour and a half, and if I had the physical book with me, I think it was only like 150 pages. I ended up donating it to the thrift store that I manage at my church, because we do have a bookcase of like religious books with like Bibles and devotionals and journals and things like that. And I thought that since I already read the book, like why not donate it, if I can speak English today, why not just donate it to the thrift store for my church, and maybe someone else will find use out of it and gain some knowledge and wisdom of, you know, what this book has to offer. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I gave it 3 stars just because like, even though I did learn a lot from it, it honestly was just kind of average. I have read similar books to it before, and it was just, you know, an ordinary type apologetics type book. I already knew kind of how I would answer certain questions to agnostics and atheists and things like that, but it was just okay. Like if you ever want to read an apologetics book that you and you haven't read an apologetics book before, I definitely recommend picking it up. It wasn't like terrible, but it was just kind of a book that I've seemed to have read in past books before, like the same sort of content. But yeah, let's get to the next book. So this book actually is a part of a series that I've been wanting to get to for a while. It's by Francine Rivers, one of my favorite authors of all time. She's a Christian fiction author, for those who don't know. And this is called A Voice in the Wind by her, Francine Rivers. And it's a part of the series called The Mark of the Lion series. I think it's just a trilogy, actually, so I shouldn't say series. It's a part of the Mark of the Lion trilogy. It's a mouthful. But this basically follows this girl. Her name is Hadassah, and she is a Jew living in Israel during the time of, like, Acts, and when the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. And this is, of course, after the death of Jesus, but it basically follows Hadassah, and she is a Christian. She's a Jewish Christian, if that makes sense. So basically, she's Jewish by ethnicity, but she is Christian by choice. So she lives in Israel, but then what happens is after the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans, her family is basically all killed, except for her and her sister. But then when her and her sister are captured by the Romans, her sister also dies. So it's just this whole sad story of like how Hadassah, is captured by the Romans, and she is brought to Rome, actually, and she is sold as a slave to this very wealthy Roman family. And she is just such a light and such a warrior for Christ. Like, she is so humble, but she does the work of Christ so well in that household that it really just shines, like the hard work that she does really makes the people that she serves really question their faith and make them question like why Hadassah is so different. And Hadassah, for me, even though she's a fictional character, she's like an inspiration, okay? She's like my hero. She is young, first of all. She's like only like 15 or 16, but her faith in Christ is so strong, and some of the things that she does or says makes me want to be just like her, because there are situations, even though this is supposed to take place back in like the days of Acts, so like in the 1st century, but like even though like she had dealt with things in the 1st century in Rome, it's definitely can be applied to like today's day and age, like just as a Christian and how to deal with certain situations. Because at the end of the day, like even though time has spanned centuries and like millennia, like we have all dealt with the same problems. Like it's just the technology that really has changed in our day and age. Do you know what I mean? Like, we're all human. We all struggle with the same things, whether it's in 2025 or if it's in, 60, 80. But anyway, I just really loved this book. It had a bittersweet ending, but I am going to read the 2nd book in February, and I can't wait to get to that because it's such a powerful story, and I think the 2nd book follows another character in this series that we meet in the 1st book, and it's just such a powerful story, and I just recommend this series to everyone. Even though I haven't finished this series yet, I definitely feel like this is going to be a great one that I'm going to recommend to everyone. And then the next book that I read was the 1st book in the Outlander series. It's just called Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, if that's how you pronounce her name. And this is a very popular book series, and it has been turned into a TV series. And I started out watching the TV series, and I watched up through like season 6, but I didn't realize that it was based on books for some reason. And even though it's like plastered all over the place that it was based off of a book, or book series, but it just didn't process in my mind that it was based on a book series. But once I like committed to wanting to read the book series, I immediately stopped watching the TV show and picked up this book. I really enjoyed it. Wait, Wait one second. Before I get to this book, I want to go back to the past book that I just read. I totally forgot that I rated this book, A Voice in the Wind by Francine Rivers, 5 stars. I forgot to tell you guys that because I just had, you know, a little bit of a brain fart, but basically I gave this book 5 stars for those who were wondering. So let's get back to Outlander. So like I was mentioning, I basically stopped watching the Outlander TV series so that I could read this book and the entirety of the Outlander series. I ended up giving this 4 stars because of the fact that there were some sexual scenes in here, some spicy scenes in here, and also some language that I just didn't appreciate. I also found that the 2 main characters, Claire and Jamie, to be so stubborn, like almost too stubborn for their own good. But basically, I enjoyed it, but like just because of like the sexual nature and the explicit scenes and language in this book specifically, and also just like the stubbornness of like the 2 characters, I gave it 4 stars. I still really enjoyed it. Like 4 stars isn't a bad rating. I would have given it 5 stars if those other things weren't there in the book. But it was definitely enjoyable, and I'm definitely gonna continue on with the series. It's a very long series. I think it has like at least 8 or 9 books in the series, and also they're chunkers. This is like literally a brick. But anyway, I don't think I mentioned what this is about. Basically, this is a historical fiction book. It's not Christian at all, of course, because it has like sexual scenes in it and explicit language. But essentially, for those who aren't familiar with like the TV series or the book series, it's a historical fiction, and it follows this woman named Claire, and she travels back in time from 1945, I believe, to 1745. So it's like a 2-year difference. 200-year difference, not a 2-year difference, a 200-year difference. And she travels through these stones in Scotland. And basically it's about her and basically just discovering how to live in Scotland in like the 1700s. And it's like this inner struggle of her wanting to go back to the time that she once was in because she was married and things, but then she ends up, you know, falling in love with this guy named Jamie, who's like a very rugged Scotsman. And it's just, this whole series is just like this monumentous plot line of like the Scottish people during their time trying to revolt against the English. But anyway, I really enjoyed it. Like I said, I gave it 4 stars, but I would have given it 5 stars if it wasn't for like the explicit sexual scenes or explicit language, or if Claire and Jamie weren't so stubborn for their own good, because I found myself getting really frustrated with them sometimes, like with the decisions that they would make. I'm like, why would you do that? Like if you just communicated, or if you just like put down your pride and just like did what you needed to do, then maybe life wouldn't be so difficult for you. But anyway, I do want to continue on with this series, and I did thoroughly enjoy this book, except for those other little minor things that I didn't like in the book. The next book that I read was The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is basically like the prequel to the Lord of the Rings series. So it basically follows this little hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, and he goes off on an adventure with all of these dwarfs to basically like get back their treasure, because this dragon has hoarded their treasure underneath this mountain. And then there's like this wizard named Gandalf who like basically assigns Bilbo Baggins, that hobbit that I was talking about, to this, you know, adventure. Like Bilbo Baggins was just like so caught off guard when like Gandalf like came to his little hobbit house and was like, oh, yep, I want you to go on this adventure with all these dwarfs to get their treasure from underneath this mountain that this dragon is protecting. And it's just like about their adventure, and it's very like atmospheric. Like I definitely felt like I was going on this adventure with them, and like just the way J.R.R. Tolkien like described this world and like his world building techniques were so beautifully written. Like I was kind of intimidated about reading this book and just like the rest of the Lord of the Rings series, just because like I'm not much of a fantasy person. I find that the world building in a lot of fantasy books can be very confusing to me. That's why one of my favorite genres is historical fiction, because even though historical fiction doesn't take place like in today's day and age, like at least it's based in like factual truths. Do you know what I mean? But with fantasy tends to be like out of this world, and like that's the same with sci-fi. Like that's why I'm not a big sci-fi person either, because it's hard for me to imagine like these fantasy or like sci-fi worlds. But J.R.R. Tolkien, I feel like, is like the king and like the father of fantasy. Like he has, you know, really set the foundation of like what fantasy should look like. And I felt like I was just going along on this adventure with Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit, and with these dwarfs to this mountain to get their treasure from this dragon. But anyway, I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars just for the fact that, like, I don't know what it was, but I just didn't get that 5-star feeling. Usually a 5-star or a 6-star read, I usually get that certain feeling. If you know what I'm talking about, you know. If you're a reader, you all know what that 5-star feeling feels like. But it just didn't, you know, give me that 5-star feeling. I don't know what it was. I can't really pinpoint like why it wasn't a 5-star, but I just gave it a 4-star just because it was just missing something that I can't really pinpoint. But I did thoroughly enjoy reading this book. I loved being in the world. I felt like I was like there, like on the adventure with them, like I was mentioning before. But yeah, I gave it 4 stars, definitely recommend it, and I can't wait to get to the rest of the Lord of the Rings series. And then the next book that I read was The Tattooist of Auschwitz by Heather Morris, and I love this book. I at first didn't want to read it because it's basically based on the real life events of this man named Lolly, and he was literally the tattooist in Auschwitz. He was one of the prisoners. He was Jewish, and he was tasked or given the job of tattooing other prisoners at Auschwitz-Birkenau, you know? And it was just this really sad but at the end uplifting story of like light overcoming darkness, because he does end up falling in love with this woman in the camp with him. And you know, I don't want to spoil anything, but you know what, honestly it's not really a spoiler, because like this basically is like a non-fiction fiction hybrid. It is based on his life, so like you can look it up on Wikipedia of like what has happened to him, but basically like he ends up getting out of the camp, and that's why this book is written about him, because he was able to tell his story to the author Heather Morris. So basically he does get out of the camp, and he ends up marrying the woman who he falls in love with in the concentration camp. And it's such a beautiful story of like redemption and like good overcoming evil. And like even though like what both Lolly and his wife Gita has gone through, like it was horrible, they, you know, overcame it in the end. And even though like even after they were released or they ran away from the concentration camp, they had to deal with a lot of, you know, the repercussions of like trauma and like PTSD. But like it's a beautiful story of like them, you know, really enduring and persevering through hardship, and like their strength is just unbelievable. There is a TV series on Peacock about them and this specific book and Lolly and Gita's story, and I just finished watching it and I cried. I literally cried my eyeballs out like a baby, because it's just so saddening that someone or a group of people would discriminate against another group of people like that and basically treat them not as human. Like they were seen as basically like animals or beasts, and like I just can't imagine that that was a part of our history as like humankind, and I just can't even imagine people doing that to other people. Like it just was so disheartening to see. But at the same time, like it's not like a happily ever after story, but it does have a somewhat happy ending. But yeah, I really love this. I definitely recommend it. I didn't feel right rating it at first, but after watching the TV series, I'm gonna give it 5 stars. Like, it's unmatched that this book is anything less than a 5 stars. Do you know what I mean? Like, this deserves to be read by everyone, and I think it's so educating as well, but definitely check this book out if you haven't already. And then I was kind of on like a World War II kick, so I read The Fortunate Ones by Katharine Hokin. I think that's, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. I think it's either Hokin or Hokin, however you pronounce it. But basically, this is a fictional story. This is not based on a true story, but it's, you know, based on true events that went on during World War II. It's basically about this girl named Inga, I think that's how you pronounce her last name, or her first name, not last name, her first name. And then this man named Felix, and Felix is Jewish and Inga is German. And Inga is basically married off when she's very young, like at the age of like 17 or 18, to this Nazi officer. And her dad is even a Nazi officer. So she's grown up with the Nazi regime, like being drilled into her head, like all this propaganda for, you know, the Nazi group, the Nazi regime, the Third Reich. And she doesn't really know any better, but at the same time she meets Felix, and Felix, before Inga is married off to this Nazi officer, she falls in love with Felix, but of course she has to go get married to this other guy who's a Nazi officer, and she is afraid to, you know, not go along with that plan because her dad is also a Nazi officer, and she's just afraid. And she was also young, so she kind of felt like she was forced into this marriage of marrying someone so much older than she was. I think he was like, you know, at least 10 or 15 years older than her. And also Felix is Jewish, so like she honestly didn't feel comfortable like marrying him knowing that she grew up in like a Nazi household. So basically they like go their separate ways. Felix actually is entered into like a concentration camp, and years, I think even decades go by, or just like one singular decade goes by, I think. And basically along this whole entire decade, it follows both Inga and Felix and on their separate paths. It kind of like goes, each chapter goes in between each character, and it's, I'm not going to give too much away, but they do end up reuniting, but like not in the way that you would expect. Like, I wasn't expecting the ending like I did. I'm not going to give too much spoilers, but like you can just imagine like that's kind of how it went. But it was such a good book. I was hooked from the moment I started reading it. It was definitely a 5-star read for me. I just loved this story. I definitely recommend giving it a read, because especially if you're into historical fiction, because I just feel like it definitely represented like the war very well. I definitely learned a lot in this book. Like, it definitely had a lot of aspects to it that I didn't realize happened during World War II. It definitely tackles a lot of issues that I didn't realize happened. But anyway, definitely go check this out. I haven't heard anyone talk about this book ever before, and I never heard of this author before either, Katharine Hokin. I picked up this book from Target like a few years ago. I've had it on my bookshelves for years at this point. And since I read The Tattooist of Auschwitz, I was kind of on like a World War II kick, and I thought, why not pick this up? Because, you know, it's a World War II historical fiction book, and I definitely recommend reading this. I feel like this is very underhyped. I haven't seen it anywhere, like I mentioned before, or this author. It was just, you know, on the shelf at Target, and I read the back of it and it sounded really interesting, so I just picked it up. And I haven't seen this author or this book being promoted like anywhere else since then, so I definitely recommend checking this out if you are interested in like World War II historical fiction books. And then the last book that I read was the 5th volume in the Remarried Empress series. It's a manga series. It's the first manga series that I've ever read. I believe there's like 8 or 9 volumes in this series. So like I just mentioned, I'm on the 5th volume. I just finished it. I now need to read the 6th volume. And as you can imagine, it's about an empress. It's like this fictionalized empire where she is basically married to this emperor who takes in a mistress, and she is just very miserable, and she tries to, you know, just deal with it, but then she ends up, you know, meeting this other guy and wants to get remarried to him and everything. And the volumes are just like about her time like wanting to get away from her husband, who is the emperor, and things like that. I don't want to give too much away, but I did give this 4 stars. I did give the first volume in this series a 5 stars, but every other volume in this series has been 4 stars, just because of like the political aspects in each book. I feel like the politics don't really interest me, and they can be a bit confusing sometimes, and that's why it gets bumped down a star for the most part. But yeah, I really am enjoying this series. I definitely recommend it to people. Like, the illustrations in this book are just like literally so beautiful. It's all in color, and that's what I was kind of looking for. Like, just, you know, look at this. That's the palace right there, and like just the amount of detail that is like in the illustrations are so stunning. And I love that it's in color, just because I know a lot of manga books are in black and white, and I wanted something that felt like more like a comic book, but not having it be a comic book, having it be like a manga series. So I'm definitely looking forward to finishing up this series. I usually can read like one of these books in just like a day. They tend to be really fast reads for me because it's a lot of just pictures and, you know, word bubbles and things like that, but I can't wait to get to the rest of this series. But yes, those are all the books that I read in January. Like I mentioned, I read a total of 7 books this month, which was a little bit more than I was expecting to read, which is always a plus. Like I mentioned, I usually average about 5 books per month, or 1 to 1.5 books per week, but I read a little bit more than that, which is great. It just knocks a few more books off of my physical TBR or to be read list. But yeah, thank you so much for watching today's video. I really appreciate you being here. Please let me know in the comments down below what you read in January and what you're looking forward to reading in February. I always love hearing what you guys have to say and what you're reading and everything, and what you're looking forward to reading. I had a really great reading month in January, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and I'm hoping for a great reading month in February. But do all the YouTube things that you know how to do, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!